The White House press briefing room was humming with restless energy. The overhead LED lights cast a bright, sterile glow, illuminating rows of reporters. Some flipped through their notes, others adjusted their cameras, all waiting for the main event. The murmurs had started well before the briefing even began. "You heard about this new press secretary?" A CNN reporter leaned over, keeping his voice low but sharp. "Yeah, she's supposed to be ruthless," his political colleague smirked, tapping his pen against the table. "Let's see how long she lasts." "A month, maybe 2. A New York Times journalist chuckled, checking his phone. "You think she's going to dodge the Omar question?" Another voice joined in, this one from the Washington Post. "Not a chance," someone muttered. The murmurs continued, speculation, bets, quiet laughter, until a Fox News reporter seated near the back spoke up. "You guys really don't know what's about to hit you, do you?" The CNN guy turned. "What, you got insider info?" The Fox reporter leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, grinning like he'd already seen this exact scene play out before. "Let's just say you're about to witness a massacre." And then the door swung open. The room fell dead silent. Every camera lens shifted. Every phone was raised. Reporters instinctively straightened their posture. They could smell blood in the water. Karoline Leavitt walked in, unhurried, composed, unshakable. She took the podium like she owned it, scanning the room with a look that wasn't just confident, it was calculated. She was here for a fight, and everyone in the room could feel it. She adjusted the mic, leaned in slightly, and delivered her opening line with razor-sharp precision. "Trump's new press secretary is about to obliterate Ilhan Omar and the entire Democratic establishment for their violence-inciting rhetoric. You guys are not going to want to miss this." For a split second, the room froze. Then, the frantic sound of pens scribbling on notepads. A few exchanged glances. Some smirked. Others clenched their jaws. They knew this wasn't going to be a press briefing. This was war. A voice sliced through the tension, breaking the brief silence that had settled like a charged wire over the room. "Peter." It was Peter Doocy, his signature calm yet loaded tone instantly recognizable. He was the kind of reporter who never wasted a question and never threw a soft one. "Thank you, Karoline." Karoline nodded, her expression unreadable. But there was a flicker of amusement in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the game they were about to play. "Are any officials here preparing to fight Democratic lawmakers in the streets?" She didn't blink. "Absolutely not." Peter barely paused. He exhaled, as if mentally flipping through the next set of cards in his hand. "Thanks for the question," he said, leaning forward slightly, going in for the first real punch of the morning. "Some elected Democrats are so steamed about Doge. Congresswoman Monica McGiver says, we are at war. Ilhan Omar says, we might actually see somebody get killed. And Chris Van Hollen says, we have to fight this in Congress, we have to fight this in the streets." There it was. The question that wasn't a question at all, but an invitation. Karoline's lips twitched. Was that an almost smile? Hard to say. She let the words settle, taking her time, as if savoring the moment before delivering the inevitable counterstrike. "So what now?" Peter asked, knowing full well the stage was hers. And then, with the kind of deliberate pacing that made even seasoned reporters brace themselves, she began. "And may I just point out," she said, her voice steady, almost casual, but laced with the kind of precision that had already made her infamous, "if you heard that type of violent inciting rhetoric from our side of the aisle, from Republican leaders on Capitol Hill." She let the thought hang for just a beat before delivering the blow. "I think there would be a lot more outrage in this room today." A flicker of reactions. A few shifting in their seats. A barely concealed smirk from the Fox News corner. The sound of someone clicking a pen just a little too aggressively. She had landed the first hit. The silence in the room wasn't just silence anymore, It was the kind of hush that came when everyone knew the next hit was coming and no one wanted to miss it. Karoline let the moment stretch, taking her time. A few seconds to let them absorb what had just happened. To let them realize they'd walked straight into a counterpunch they weren't ready for. And then she went in again. It's unacceptable, the comments that have been made by these Democrat leaders. Her voice was steady, calm, measured. But there was a new edge to it. No more subtle jabs. This was a direct strike. And frankly, they don't even know what they are talking about. From the press pool, a few pens froze midair. Some reporters exchanged quick glances. Had she really just said that outright? She had. And she wasn't stopping. Leaning slightly into the mic, she kept her tone even, precise, like she was explaining simple math to a room full of people who had somehow failed to grasp basic addition. President Trump was elected with a mandate from the American people to make this government more efficient. A few brows lifted. It wasn't the first time they'd heard this talking point. But the way Karoline delivered it, sharp, confident, daring anyone to challenge her, gave it a whole new weight. He campaigned across this country with Elon Musk, vowing that Elon was going to head up the Department of Government Efficiency. That got their attention. Elon Musk. If there was one name guaranteed to light up a press briefing, it was that one. The two of them, with a great team around them, were going to look at the receipts of this federal government and ensure it's accountable to American taxpayers. She paused. Not because she needed to, but because she wanted them to sit with that for a second. Then, with the slightest hint of a knowing smirk, she delivered the finishing line, clean, precise, unshakable. That's all that is happening here. No drama. No spectacle. Just a simple fact. Across the room, fingers tapped a little faster on keyboards. A few reporters exchanged wordless looks, waiting to see who'd step into the ring next. Karoline stood firm, her expression unchanged. It was their move now. And frankly, she had nothing to lose. The pause after the last exchange wasn't long, but it was enough. Reporters shifted. Laptops clicked open. Whispers traded across the room. It was the telltale signs of a recalibration were happening, then a familiar voice cut through. And then, one more thing, Karoline tilted her head slightly. Ah, there it was. NBC was reporting that some of the illegal immigrants who had been rounded up and arrested were not being deported. The reporter's voice remained even, but the weight behind his words was deliberate. Instead, they were being released with ankle or wrist monitoring devices, or they just had to check in over the phone. A measured breath. So, is the administration arresting more people than you have room for? That wasn't just a question, it was a setup. If she acknowledged it outright, it would sound like an admission of failure. If she dodged, they'd pounce. Karoline did neither. Instead, she smiled, just barely, and stepped directly into the fire. I've seen the reports, and I'm glad you brought it up because we want to address it. A simple but strategic pivot. She wasn't defending, she was owning the issue before anyone else could frame it for her. She held the room's gaze, delivering the next part, clean, controlled, unshakable. As of this morning, according to the information I received from DHS, a total of 461 illegal aliens have been released from custody. Pen scratched. Fingers tapped faster. She let it sink in, then dropped the hammer. Out of the more than 8,000 arrested since President Trump took office, that's less than 6%. A shift, not dramatic, but noticeable. A few reporters recalibrated their posture, realizing this wasn't going the way they expected. But Karoline, she was just getting started. And the reasons for their release? There are several. She raised a finger, ticking them off one by one, not rushed, not defensive, but deliberate. For some, there is no significant likelihood of removal in the foreseeable future. For others, it's a matter of detention availability, something this president and this administration have been incredibly vocal about. And in some cases, serious medical conditions were a factor. No fluff. No over-explaining. Just facts, served cold. Then she twisted the knife. But let's be clear, none of them have final deportation orders. Many are likely contesting their immigration status. She let that sit for a second, then casually rested a hand on the podium, an unspoken challenge. And if you want more details, I'd refer you to DHS. But I came prepared with this information because I knew it would be a question today. She nodded, effectively shutting the door on the subject. A beat of silence. Not because they didn't have follow-ups, of course, they did. But because this wasn't the answer they were expecting. The air in the press room shifted, just slightly, but noticeably. Political sparring over domestic issues was standard. But Gaza, war, US military intervention, this wasn't just another heated exchange. This was the kind of question that could make headlines for weeks. A voice cut through, measured, deliberate, not in a rush. Whoever was asking knew they were setting the stage for something bigger. The president and you have made it clear, given the devastation, you believe Palestinians have no choice but to leave Gaza. Across the room, a few reporters lifted their heads from their screens, sensing this wasn't just another policy question. It was the question. But Palestinians say this is their home. They don't want to go. And then, the real bombshell. Last night, the president said he's willing to use the military if necessary. Is the US prepared to remove Palestinians from Gaza by force? A few chairs shifted, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that even those used to this kind of back and forth felt the weight of the moment. Karoline didn't flinch. She looked directly at the reporter, her expression giving nothing away. The president is prepared to rebuild Gaza, for Palestinians and for all people in the region. Those who seek peace. Those who want real economic development and opportunity. The answer was precise. Unshaken. Not a retreat. Not an escalation. This is a region that has been controlled by Hamas, a terrorist organization backed by Iran, that has brutalized not just Israelis, but Palestinians as well. Some fingers paused mid-typing, as if realizing this wasn't just a response. It was a reframing of the entire narrative. It is because of Hamas that you see those images on that screen. It is because of Hamas that Gaza has become a demolition site, because they launched that brutal attack on Israel on October 7th. Silence. Not uncommon in these briefings, but this was different. This wasn't silence of disinterest. It was the kind that came when something landed, and people were processing it in real time. Karoline didn't break stride. Once again, let me emphasize, President Trump wants to ensure this can be a place where all people can live in peace. A beat. Then she dropped it, clean, firm, undeniable. He is a peacemaker in chief. Some exchanged glances. Not in disbelief, but in recognition. They had heard this phrase before. And they knew exactly what it meant. He made that very clear in his first term. The topic wasn't closed, but the balance had shifted. As for how that will be accomplished, the president and his team are talking with our allies in the region to consider next steps. It wasn't over. But the conversation was now on her terms. Then, another voice, quick, direct, refusing to let the moment pass. But should the American people be prepared to see US military on the ground, fighting a war against Hamas? The room held its breath, not out of fear, but out of anticipation. Karoline didn't look to anyone for confirmation. No glances at briefing notes. She already knew the answer. Once again, the president has not committed to US troops in the region. Then, deliberate, slow, unshakable. But it is an option. A journalist in the front row blinked, as if confirming to himself that he had heard that correctly. In the back, someone leaned forward ever so slightly, anticipating what might come next. Pens hit notepads. Screens flickered as headlines took shape. She hadn't committed to anything. But she hadn't ruled it out either. If the last question was a loaded gun, this one was a landmine. Garrett leaned in, a voice steady, calculated. The kind of question that wasn't just for the press room. It was for every voter watching at home. On Gaza, the president has spent basically his entire public career criticizing foreign entanglements, nation-building, sending American troops to fight abroad, especially in the Middle East. He paused, letting that thought settle before going in for the real strike. This plan seems like it could ultimately involve all of those things. Can you explain this reversal? And how does building and owning Gaza fit with an America First foreign policy? A few heads turned, not toward Karoline, but toward each other. That was the question. Not about military intervention. Not about humanitarian efforts. But about whether Trump was violating his own doctrine. Karoline took it in stride. No flicker of hesitation. No visible irritation. Instead, she tilted her head slightly as if considering the weight of the question, then proceeded to dismantle it piece by piece. I would reject the premise of your question, she began, voice firm but not combative, that this somehow forces the United States into an entanglement abroad. She let that hang for just a second before driving it home. The president has not committed to putting boots on the ground in Gaza. That was her first line of defense. Not new information, but repositioned. This wasn't about war. This was about strategy. He has also said that the United States is not going to pay for the rebuild of Gaza. That was the second blow. A direct counter to the assumption that this was another costly intervention on America's dime. She adjusted the mic, her voice unwavering. His administration is going to work with our partners in the region to reconstruct this area. A simple statement. But the subtext was clear. This isn't America's burden. This is a deal to be made. Karoline took a step back, not physically, but rhetorically. And let me just take a step back here because this is an out-of-the-box idea, but that's who President Trump is. A few reporters scribbled something down, recognizing the pivot. That's why the American people elected him. And there it was. The first real shift in the conversation. This wasn't about contradicting America First. This was America First in action. His goal is lasting peace in the Middle East for all people in the region. She didn't say nation building. She didn't say military presence. She framed it as an outcome, not an intervention. And then she tightened the argument. As I said in my opening remarks, we've had the same people pushing the same solutions to this problem for decades. No names. No need. Everyone in the room knew exactly who she was talking about. And it has been made very clear to the president that the United States needs to be involved in this rebuilding effort to ensure stability in the region for all people. Another shift. Not entangled. Not funding. But ensuring. And before anyone could jump in with another question, she closed the door on the argument before it even started. That does not mean boots on the ground in Gaza. It does not mean American taxpayers will be funding this effort. And then the final move. It means Donald Trump, who is the best dealmaker on the planet, is going to strike a deal with our partners in the region. A subtle smirk. Not arrogance, but certainty. Some reporters leaned forward slightly, not because they didn't see the answer coming, but because it had just been locked in as a headline. This wasn't a reversal. This was Trump doing exactly what Trump does best. For a moment, the press room felt like a courtroom. Everyone was waiting for a list. A robust, commanding roster of allies standing with Trump on his Gaza vision. Instead, Karoline did what Karoline does best. She dismantled the expectation before it could take shape. The Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Saudis, a reporter fired off. They've already rejected this plan. So who, if anyone, is actually on board? A calculated pause. Karoline leaned in slightly. Not defensive. Not flustered. Just poised. The president has been socializing this idea for quite some time, she said. This wasn't a snap decision. A few skeptical glances exchanged across the room. Socializing, that was a Washington way of saying testing the waters without commitment. Karoline let the tension sit for half a beat, then cut through it with precision. His first foreign leader call, President El-Sisi of Egypt. Not a guess. Not speculation. A fact. Next week, his meeting with King Abdullah of Jordan. More facts. He has spoken directly with the King of Bahrain and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Some reporters started typing again. Because now, the story wasn't just who rejected Trump's plan, but who Trump is still working on. And just like that, the momentum shifted. A different voice took over, shifting the focus. Karoline, I'd like to show you something. A monitor flickered on. It was Gaza. Fox News footage looping through what could only be described as an apocalyptic wasteland, collapsed buildings, streets reduced to dust, a world that no longer looked livable. The voice returned. This is an uninhabitable place for human beings. No water. No electricity. Do you really believe families can build their future here? A question that came not just with skepticism, but with visual proof of its weight. Karoline, again, didn't blink. I've seen these images, she said. The president has seen them. A few cameras zoomed in. In fact, Steve Witkoff, one of the president's top envoys, went to Gaza himself. He saw it with his own eyes, brought back photos, and showed them directly to President Trump. That changed the room. This wasn't Trump making decisions from an ivory tower. This was Trump seeing the reality through the eyes of someone he trusted. And the president made this decision, Karoline continued, with a humanitarian heart for all people in the region. Then, a curveball no one expected. Karoline, I have a question about today's executive order. A few eyebrows raised. From war in Gaza to U.S. domestic policy now. But the reporter didn't flinch. How will this impact the 2028 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles? A few reporters exchanged smirks. Not because the question wasn't serious, but because they knew exactly where this was going. For example, the reporter continued, would a man who identifies as a transgender woman be allowed to compete as a female on U.S. soil? If there was ever a moment to watch how quickly Karoline could pivot and control a narrative, this was it. She didn't stall. She didn't stumble. She smiled. That's a great question. And just like that, Gaza was no longer the story. The longer the headline, the clearer the message. The president has made it very clear that he expects the Olympic Committee and the NC to no longer allow men to compete in women's sports. A few laptops clicked open again because this was news. With the signing of his pen today, the president is starting a very public pressure campaign to make sure these organizations do what's right for women and for girls across the country. There it was, the transition was complete. One moment, it was about war, global conflict, and America's role in Gaza. The next, it was about protecting women's sports. And just like that, Trump had managed to be at the center of both conversations on his terms. A murmur rippled through the room. Karoline had just laid it out, the president's signature would put an end to biological men competing in women's sports. The weight of it was still settling in when a voice from the third row cut through the silence. And what about the media? A few heads turned. The question had landed like a dart. Groups like ACLU and GLAAD still refer to men as transgender females. Karoline looked up. Which outlets? A pause. Politico included. That did it. The entire room shifted, subtle but noticeable. A few eyes darted toward the Politico reporter in the room. Some fingers hesitated over keyboards, as if recalculating the weight of what they were about to type. Karoline adjusted the mic, her expression unreadable. "Right before I walked in here," she said, "I was made aware of USAID funding media outlets, including Politico." A second of quiet. Then a reporter from the left side of the room leaned forward. "How much?" Karoline didn't need to check notes. "Over $8 million taxpayer dollars," she said. "Used to subsidize subscriptions to Politico." A few murmurs. The rustling of paper. Someone at the back let out a low whistle. The Politico correspondent in the room was stone-faced. "That will no longer be happening." More typing. Some hushed whispers. A hand shot up. "So just to be clear, you said..." Karoline cut in before the question could finish. "The DOJ is working on canceling those payments as we speak." More heads turned. This was moving fast. "This administration is reviewing every line item in the federal budget." A pause. "If it doesn't serve the American people, it's gone." The murmurs in the room had settled, but the weight of the discussion hadn't. A voice from the right side of the room cut in. "Is this really a good use of American taxpayer dollars?" Karoline didn't need to ask for clarification. Everyone knew what this was about, you said, government waste, and billions vanishing into thin air. She gave a small nod. "If it's not," she said, "that funding will no longer be sent abroad. And because of that effort, American taxpayers will see real savings." Another reporter leaned forward. "Yet there are a lot of Democrats furious about these cuts," he said. "Not about the waste itself, but about the fact that it's being exposed." Karoline folded her arms. "If you want to know who doesn't have America's best interests at heart," she said, "just look at who's upset that Elon is exposing corruption." A few murmurs. A few keyboards clacking. And then the numbers hit the room like a hammer. $5 million paid to Ben Stiller to meet with Zelensky in Ukraine. A couple of reporters blinked. $600 million for Starbucks coffee cups for the government. The whispers started again. "It's all a sham. And if you ask me," Karoline let the moment hang for just a second, "it's money laundering." Some reporters shifted in their seats. Others looked up, pens hovering over notepads. They take taxpayer dollars, cycle them through pet projects, and somehow, she gestured vaguely, it always ends up back in the right pockets. A pause. "But not anymore." Before the tension could settle, a voice from the back row spoke up. To give some love to the back of the room, they hadn't been called on much in years past. A few chuckles. "Reagan, go ahead." A reporter from the far left of the room stood. "Thanks, Karoline. The WHCA just announced that comedian Amber Ruffin will be hosting this year's dinner." Some heads turned. "She once called the president a toddler with his pants pulled down." Any reaction to that? "And will the president be attending?" Karoline gave a light shrug. "Certainly an interesting choice." A few smiles. A few raised eyebrows. "I have the president's invitation on my desk," she continued. "And mine as well." A beat. "Haven't talked to the boss about it, but when he decides, I'll let you all know." The room wasn't quiet, not this time. Karoline had barely finished her last statement before a voice jumped in. "On the executive order being signed today, you said it will be enforced. But how? At what level? Schools? Globally?" Another reporter cut in before she could answer. "And human rights groups say this could expose kids to discrimination." Karoline tilted her head slightly. "Expose kids to discrimination," she repeated, as if rolling the phrase around in her mind. Then, without skipping a beat, "You mean like forcing young girls to shower in locker rooms with biological men?" The room stilled. Or making them compete against someone with a biological advantage so overwhelming they never even had a chance? The words weren't harsh, but they landed like bricks. If you're looking for victims of discrimination, start there. She didn't let the silence linger. And as for enforcement, she checked her watch. In about an hour and a half, this will be federal law. A shrug. Schools should comply. Seems simple enough. She gestured toward another reporter. Taylor, Spectrum News. You talked about DOJ. Elon Musk is a, quote, special government employee. He also owns companies that have billions. In federal contracts, conflict of interest, there it was, the Musk question. Karoline exhaled, not annoyed, not defensive, just amused. You think Elon Musk is doing this for money? She let the question hang there for a second. The man is the richest person on earth. He doesn't need a side hustle. Somewhere in the back, a stifled chuckle. If there's a conflict of interest, Elon will remove himself. That's what the president said. That's what Elon has said. A shrug. And considering he's already abided by every federal law, I'd say that's more than we can say for most of Washington. Someone coughed. Another keyboard clicked. She moved on before anyone else could jump in. Trade advisor Peter Navarro said tariffs will lower taxes for Americans. Is that the official White House stance? Karoline didn't even blink. The president has always been clear. Tariffs are a tax on foreign nations. A beat. And before we had income tax, America ran on tariffs. And America was never more prosperous. Someone from the back muttered something. She ignored it. Now, if you're suggesting we go back to 1913, before the income tax was introduced. She let that sit for a second, scanning the room. I mean, I'd love to see some of you volunteer 90% of your paycheck to the government. But hey, maybe that's a platform the other side is working on. A pause. Then laughter. Not forced, not exaggerated, just genuine, uncomfortable, and unavoidable. Karoline folded her hands. Next question. A reporter raised his hand. Karoline, you said Elon Musk isn't in this for the money, but is profiting from government contracts. How do you reconcile that? Karoline let out a small breath, as if she'd been expecting the question. You know what's funny? She asked, glancing around the room. Elon Musk actually lost millions helping Donald Trump's campaign. That got their attention. He's not here for personal gain. He's got two priorities in life, colonizing Mars and making sure this government stops hemorrhaging money like a drunken sailor. A few chuckles. And if eliminating waste means stepping on some toes? Believe me, he's doing it without blinking. She leaned forward just slightly. The thing is, I don't think people hate Elon because they believe he's corrupt. She tilted her head. I think they just can't stand the idea that one guy can be so wildly successful in so many different things. A pause. And let's be honest, if we're talking about envy, we know which party tends to struggle with that. Another reporter jumped in. Karoline, if Trump really follows through on eliminating the income tax, wouldn't that be historic? Karoline didn't hesitate. If Donald Trump removes the federal income tax, not only will it be historic, he'll go down as one of the greatest presidents of all time. She let that land. In fact, if he pulls that off, I say we start making room on Mount Rushmore. That did it. A few reporters exchanged amused glances. Some smirked. A couple tapped their pens against notepads, probably noting down a headline. Karoline shrugged. Because let's be real, before Trump, no politician even had the guts to bring this up. A beat. Why? Because he's not a politician. She tapped the podium lightly. He's a businessman. And America? He's running it like a business. A question lingered in the air. So if that's the case, Are we about to see the golden age of America? Karoline exhaled. Not in exasperation, but in amusement. If Trump gets this done, if we actually eliminate the income tax. She let a small, knowing smile play at the corner of her lips. I'd say buckle up. The room was silent. Not out of disbelief. Not out of shock. But out of something else. The realization that, for once, the impossible wasn't off the table. Karoline let the moment hang there for just a second longer than necessary. Then, with practiced ease, she adjusted the mic, gave a small nod, and turned on her heel. The door clicked shut behind her, muffling the renewed flurry of voices inside the briefing room. The tension. The sparring. The push and pull. It was all part of the game. And she had just played it flawlessly. Karoline exhaled as she walked down the long hallway. The morning had been sharp. Relentless. But now, it was just noon. She reached into her bag, pulling out her phone. A single message lit up the screen. Elon Musk, a nice delivery. Lunch at the usual place? She smirked, shaking her head as she typed back. Karoline, I don't get paid enough for this. Send. With that, she stepped outside, the bright DC sun hitting her face. She didn't slow down. Not today. The golden age had just begun.